Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Sophomore English. We turn now in our study of fiction and unit number 2 to page 383 and following. Italo Calvino's The Garden of Stubborn Cats, which is of course a very strange title. We'll obviously have to pay attention to what's up with this title. Before we get there though, turn in your hymnals real quickly to 369, just turned back. And this is our to-be topic for literary analysis. Write it down. Symbolism, a writer's use of symbols. A symbol is a type of figurative language in which a character, place, thing, or an event in a literary work stands for a larger idea, right? Can either call on traditional associations, connotations, or it can create new associations. We also want to pay attention to this word allegory as well again. We've got a symbol diagram there provided for you on 369, and of course our desire to draw a few conclusions along the way. Let's turn and meet Calvino really quickly on page 383, along with the vocabulary, of course, of 382, yes? Calvino, 1923 to 1985, the son of two Italian botanists. Calvino was born in Cuba, grew up in San Remo on the Italian Riviera, and began his literary career in the Italian city of Turin. According to Calvino, quote, "A classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say," end quote. I like that. Did you see that quote? I like that quote when we talk about what is classic music. Like always in the genre of rap music, for example. We don't even use that term much anymore. But in that genre of music, there's always this question, what's the classics? Well, take a look again at it. A classic is a work that never finished saying what it has to say. It continues to somehow speak to us, right? Calvino's own works are classics. They say much more than appears on the page. Through his ideas, though his ideas are complex, Calvino conveys them using events and characters as simple as those in a fable or a fairy tale. Like a good fable, his stories blend reality and fantasy. During the Second World War, Calvino actually joined the Italian resistance to fight Italy's fascist dictatorships. The background for the story is here on page 383. This story is one of the interrelated short stories in Calvino's Marco Valdo, or The Seasons in the City. Set in a grim Italian industrial city in the 1950s and 60s, the collection presents the adventures of Marco Valdo, an ordinary working man as he uses his imagination to escape his surroundings. Let's turn now to The Garden of Stubborn Cats. Write this down at 2B really quickly. We're going to ask this question. As we get into this story, right away you're going to see this. Ask your question this way. What do the cats in this text symbolize? Now, normally I've got two different kinds of sophomore readers of this text. Those who love cats. I mean, all you got to do is just, have a picture of a cat and they just start oohing and awing. And those who seem to almost like detest cats or are afraid of them. We're going to see interesting responses to both sides of this view of cats here, okay? When right away we start talking about the city of cats and the city of men. By the end of the story, we're going to ask, what is symbolic about this story? I have sometimes had sophomores who say the following. I'll see if it works for you. This story is the simplest, most complex story they've read thus far in sophomore English. Incredibly simple to read and understand, but very complex in terms of the way that it plays its game. Now, for those of you who are cat lovers, you're going to love a number of the photographs that are in your hymnal here to give you pictures of kitty cats all the way through. But let's go ahead and say it out loud. This story seems to be about a whole lot more than cats, and come to think of it, this story may not even be about cats at all. Let's see what we think about this. Now, if you're a good reader, as you're developing into, you've already scanned a number of pages so that you can get some sense of how long this story is and what our levels of concentration and focus will need to be. All right? We've again, in our text here at level 1, we've got Marco Valdo, who is again our kind of Italian worker in our story. And he's going to discover an old villa in a dilapidated garden where cats congregate. What is going on with that? Let's go to work with the story, see how well we can get through it, all right? Here we go.
The Garden of Stubborn Cats by Italo Calvino, translated by William Weaver. The city of cats and the city of men exist one inside the other. but they are not the same city. Few cats recall the time when there was no distinction. The streets and squares of men were also streets and squares of cats, and the lawns, courtyards, balconies, and fountains, you lived in a broad and various space. But for several generations now, domestic felines have been prisoners of an uninhabitable city. The streets are uninterruptedly overrun by the mortal traffic of cat-crushing automobiles. In every square foot of terrain, where once a garden extended, or a vacant lot, or the ruins of an old demolition, now condominiums loom up, welfare housing, brand new skyscrapers. Every entrance is crammed with parked cars. The courtyards, one by one, have been roofed by reinforced concrete and transformed into garages or movie houses or storerooms or workshops. And where a rolling plateau of low roofs once extended, copings, terraces, water tanks, balconies, skylights, corrugated iron sheds, now one general superstructure rises wherever structures can rise. The intermediate differences in height between the low ground of the street and the supernal heaven of the penthouses disappear. The cat of a recent litter seeks in vain the itinerary of its fathers, the point from which to make the soft leap from balustrade to cornice to drainpipe, or for the quick climb on the roof tiles. But in this vertical city, in this compressed city where all voids tend to fill up, and every block of cement tends to mingle with other blocks of cement, a kind of counter-city opens, a negative city that consists of empty slices between wall and wall, of the minimal distances ordained by the building regulations between two constructions, between the rear of one construction and the rear of the next. It is a city of cavities, wells, air conduits, driveways, inner yards, accesses to basements, like a network of dry canals on a planet of stucco and tar. And it is through this network, grazing the walls, that the ancient cat population still scurries.
All right, let's pause. Put it in your notes now. We've got two cities that are represented. The cities of men, represented, of course, by skyscrapers, lots of buildings, lots of noise, cars going everywhere. And the city of cats, which is a different kind of city, we might say. That is to say, we have the urbane versus the natural, maybe in its already developing symbolism, right? The cats, of course, can symbolize what happened to nature as a result of progress. We can think of it that way. Maybe also they represent the passage of time, when there was no distinction between the city of men and the city of cats. We might think about it that way. In other words, there was a time when they were able to live side by side. But with all of the evolving technologies, let's write that word down already at level 1. This will be a text that will critique technologies. We've seen this already a number of times in other titles we've been studying. We're going to play the same game all over again. There was a time. Notice now the city is compressed. A compressed city, the vertical city, the compressed city, where you have all these little hidden spots. And now that's where the cats have to live, have to exist. We're on page 386 now. Here we go. Let's go to work. Now that we've been introduced to the opening feel of this story.
On occasion, to pass the time, Waldo would follow a cat. It was during the work break, between noon and 3, when all the personnel, except Waldo, went home to eat. And he, who brought his lunch in his bag, laid his place among the packing cases in the warehouse, chewed his snack, smoked a half cigar, and wandered around, alone and idle, waiting for work to resume. In those hours, a cat that peeped in at a window was always welcome company and a guide for new explorations. He had made friends with a tabby, well-fed, a blue ribbon around its neck, surely living with some well-to-do family. This tabby shared with Waldo the habit of an afternoon stroll right after lunch, and naturally a friendship sprang up. Following his tabby friend, Waldo had started looking at places as if through the round eyes of a cat. And even if these places were the usual environs of his firm, he saw them in a different light, as settings for cattish stories, with connections practicable only by light, velvety paws. Though from the outside the neighborhood seemed poor in cats, every day on his rounds, Marco Valdo made the acquaintance of some new face, and a meow, a hiss, a stiffening of fur on an arched back was enough for him to sense ties and intrigues and rivalries among them. At those moments, he thought he had already penetrated the secrecy of the feline society. And then he felt himself scrutinized by pupils that became slits, under the surveillance of the antennae of taut whiskers, and all the cats around him sat impassive as sphinxes, the pink triangles of their noses converging on the black triangles of their lips, and the only things that moved were the tips of the ears, with a vibrant jerk like radar. They reached the end of a narrow passage between squalid blank walls, and looking around,
387.
Marco Valdo saw that the cats that had led him this far had vanished, all of them together. No telling in which direction, even his tabby friend, and they had left him alone. Their realm had territories, ceremonies, customs that it was not yet granted to him to discover.
Now let's pause for a moment. If you remember back, a 3A observation, if you remember back to your freshman year, we did a poem by T.S. Eliot from his book of cats, McCavity, the Mystery Cat. Eliot was thoroughly convinced that cats are a different kind of creature than any other mammal on the planet. And he was thoroughly convinced they have personality, real personality, like they're like humans of a kind. Notice the game that we're getting played here. 2 observations. 1, and we're already possibly at a 2A observation for this text. He tries to see the world through the eyes of a cat. In other words, to see the world differently than we normally see the world. And when you look through the eyes of a cat, the world looks totally different. I remember one year, just to prove this, I said, you guys have been sitting in 303 quite some time. You know this room really well. Let's see the world from a different perspective. And we all got on the floor and laid looking up at the ceiling. Of course, immediately you could see under the table that you're sitting at right now. Immediately you would have a different perspective by virtue of laying on the ground. The exact same space, but perceived totally different, right? A major, we could say, major message already of this text is see the world differently. Try to perceive the world differently. Number 2, he is attracted to these cats, and he finds himself following these cats, wanting to be somehow friends with these cats. This has always been an interesting question. Can humans and animals actually be friends? I have cat lovers, dog lovers who say absolutely they can be friends. I have others that say nope, cannot be the same, and here's why. You can't have communication. It's a different thing. You can talk to a cat, but the cat can't really talk back to you. You can talk to your dog, but your dog can't talk. I know, don't get into the my dog can talk to me line of argument. But this line of viewing says they're kind of 2 different worlds, and to try and crawl inside of a cat's world is something that just can't be done. Notice though in this story, that is exactly what our hero is going to try to do. What is going on with all these cats? Watch.
On the other hand, from the cat city there opened unsuspected peepholes onto the city of men. And one day, the same tabby led him to discover the great Biarritz restaurant. Anyone wishing to see the Biarritz restaurant had only to assume the posture of a cat, that is, proceed on all 4s. Cat and man, in this fashion, walked around a kind of dome, at whose foot some low rectangular little windows opened. Following the tabby's example, Marco Valdo looked down. They were transoms through which the luxurious hall received air and light. To the sound of gypsy violins, partridges and quails swirled by on silver dishes, balanced by the white-gloved fingers of waiters in tailcoats. Or more precisely, above the partridges and quails the dishes whirled, and above the dishes the white gloves, and poised on the waiters' patent leather shoes the gleaming parquet floor, from which hung dwarf potted palms and tablecloths and crystal, and buckets like bells with the champagne bottle for their clapper. Everything was turned upside down because Marco Valdo, for fear of being seen, wouldn't stick his head inside the window and confined himself to looking at the reversed reflection of the room in the tilted pane. But it was not so much the windows of the dining room as those of the kitchens that interested the cat. Looking through the former, you saw, distant and somehow transfigured, what in the kitchens presented itself
388.
quite concrete and within paw's reach as a plucked bird or a fresh fish. And it was toward the kitchens, in fact, that the tabby wanted to lead Marco Valdo, either through a gesture of altruistic friendship or else because it counted on the man's help for one of its raids. Marco Valdo, however, was reluctant to leave his belvedere over the main room, first as he was fascinated by the luxury of the place, and then because something down there had riveted his attention to such an extent that, overcoming his fear of being seen, he kept peeking in with his head in the transom. In the midst of the room, directly under that pane, there was a little glass fish tank, a kind of aquarium, where some fat trout were swimming. A special customer approached, a man with a shiny bald pate, black suit, black beard. An old waiter in tailcoat followed him, carrying a little net, as if he were going to catch butterflies. The gentleman in black looked at the trout with a grave, intent air. Then he raised one hand and with a slow, solemn gesture singled out a fish. The waiter dipped the net into the tank, pursued the appointed trout, captured it, headed for the kitchens, holding out in front of him like a lance the net in which the fish wriggled. The gentleman in black, solemn as a magistrate who has handed down a capital sentence, went to take his seat and wait for the return of the trout, sautéed à la meunière. If I found a way to drop a line from up here and make one of those trout bite, Marco Valdo thought, I couldn't be accused of theft, at worst of fishing in an unauthorized place. And ignoring the meows that called him toward the kitchens, he went to collect his fishing tackle. Nobody in the crowded dining room of the Biarritz saw the long, fine line armed with hook and bait as it slowly dropped into the tank. The fish saw the bait and flung themselves on it. In the fray, one trout managed to bite the worm, and immediately it began to rise, emerge from the water. A silvery flash. It darted up high over the laid tables and the trolleys of hors d'oeuvres, over the blue flames of the crepe Suzette, until it vanished into the heavens of the transom.
All right, let's pause for a moment. Write it down at level 1. You got this interesting thing where he's following the cat around. He ends up above this restaurant, and he sees these trout in a big pool, a big container, and he wants to try and catch one. So he puts his line down, catches the trout, and up the trout goes. You have a really interesting kind of picture in your mind's eye as you see something like this going down, right? Okay, let's see what happens next. Again, a very simple story, right? Just kind of tells you what's going on.
Marco Valdo had yanked the rod with the brisk snap of the expert fisherman, so the fish landed behind his back. The trout had barely touched the ground when the cat sprang.
Right?
What little life the trout still had was lost between the tabby's teeth.
389.
Marco Valdo, who had abandoned his line at that moment to run and grab the fish, saw it snatched from under his nose, hook and all. He was quick to put one foot on the rod, but the snatch had been so strong that the rod was all the man had left, while the tabby ran off with the fish, pulling the line after it. Treacherous kitty! It had vanished. But this time, it wouldn't escape him. There was that long line trailing after him and showing the way he had taken. Though he had lost sight of the cat, Marco Valdo followed the end of the line. There it was, running along a wall. It climbed a parapet, wound through a doorway, was swallowed up by a basement. Marco Valdo, venturing into more and more caddish places, climbed roofs, straddled railings, always managed to catch a glimpse, perhaps only a second before it disappeared, of that moving trace that indicated the thief's path. Now the line played out down a sidewalk in the midst of the traffic, and Marco Valdo, running after it, almost managed to grab it. He flung himself down on his belly. There! He grabbed it. He managed to seize one end of the line before it slipped between the bars of a gate.
Let's pause for a moment and note the interesting irony. He catches the fish with a line. The cat catches the fish and runs off. He goes after the cat by virtue of the line. He grabs hold of the line by jumping to grab hold of the line the way a trout would jump to catch the worm on the line. So you got this interesting reversal. It's like the cat has caught him instead of him catching the cat. Got me? Do you understand the interesting dimension here? And so he wants to know now all of a sudden, where's that cat taking my fish? And in the process, he's going to discover something about the world of cats. Let's play that game now, all right? The world of cats.
Beyond a half-rusted gate and 2 bits of wall buried under climbing plants, there was a little rank garden with a small, abandoned-looking building at the far end of it. A carpet of dry leaves covered the path, and dry leaves lay everywhere under the boughs of the 2 plane trees, forming actually some little mounds in the yard.
390.
A layer of leaves was yellowing in the green water of a pool. Enormous buildings rose all around, skyscrapers with thousands of windows, like so many eyes trained disapprovingly on that little square patch with 2 trees, a few tiles, and all those yellow leaves, surviving right in the middle of an area